today's event. Before I introduce our speakers today, let me bring to your attention an event being held at the CUNY Graduate Center on Friday, April 28th at 6 p.m. I believe Dylan's going to put it in the chat for those of you on Zoom. It's at 6 p.m. At the Graduate Center on Fifth Avenue. There is a panel discussion titled Iran and its Constitutions, with an S, Historical Reflections for the Present. I'll just very briefly mention the four speakers. There'll be Janet Al-Fari, Saeed Rahnama, Bahare Ibn Alian, and Andrew Arato. And the moderator will be Sarah.
Here we go. Okay, let's see what happens.
Can people hear me? Is that the issue?
All right, we're good now. All right, should be all set. Sorry, thank you for your patience.
Sure. For those of you on Zoom, I think you maybe missed it, but I'll just direct you to the chat function where there is an announcement about an event on Friday, April 28th about Iran and its constitution. So just please consult the link that's in the chat about a very promising event by our colleagues at CUNY. It's a pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's wonderful event. We have two excellent historians, and we're lucky to feature a forthcoming book, specifically by Dr. Beeta Baghoolizadeh, who is a historian of memory, visuality, and race. Currently, Dr. Baghoolizadeh is an associate research scholar at Princeton University's Mozaffari Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. She earned her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania's Department of History, and has been a recipient of many awards, fellowships, and is the author of many publications, essays, both online, but also in peer-reviewed journals such as Lateral, the Journal of the Cultural Studies Association, and the American Historical Review. I believe there's a forthcoming piece about to come out any day now, any week now. But let me also mention a brilliant essay titled From Religious Eulogy to War Anthem, examining Khordadzade's Leila Begofta and the Blackness in the Late 20th Century Iran, which was published a couple years ago in Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It's specifically in 2021. Let me also add that Dr. Baghoolizadeh has a very easily navigatable website with very useful, wonderful portal with information about all of our research, and so forth, including her wonderful artwork. So I do recommend you Google and find that and make use of that. Today, we're fortunate, as I mentioned, that she will be presenting to us a sort of sneak peek at her forthcoming volume titled The Color Black, Enslavement and Erasure in Iran. This monograph will be published by Duke University Press and will cover as the subtitle states, enslavement and its erasure in modern Iran. We'll wait for the presentation to discuss this further. But we're also fortunate today to have Professor Nahid Mozaffari, who's a historian of the late Qajar period as well as the early Pahlavi era. And she herself has also examined the question of slavery. Dr. Mozaffari is a senior research scholar at the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies at Leipzig University. Dr. Mozaffari earned her PhD in history from the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University, and she's taught at the New School for Social Research New York University in Paris, but also our very own Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies here at NYU. She's the author of many articles. Let me just mention a couple of them. In 2009, she published an essay in the edited volume titled The Iranian Constitutional Revolution. The essay was titled Crafting Constitutionalism, an Iranian Secular Modernist Project. And in another volume titled Targeting Iran, she published an article titled Culture and Resistance, Writing Back to Power. She is currently finishing an edited volume titled Multiple Histories of Slavery in Qajar, Iran. So the way we'll proceed is that the floor will hand the floor over to Beeta for about a 35-minute presentation. And then we'll have Nahid present for about 10 to 15 minutes, some questions and reflections on Beeta's writing, and that will leave us with a good amount of time for questions from the floor as well as from Zoom. For those of you who are on Zoom, you can type up your questions in the chat function, and we'll try our best to get to them in the Q&A section. So without further ado.
That was a really generous introduction. Oh, I got kicked off the meeting.
I think they said you had to share your.
No, I got kicked off of it, so I have to log back in. Sorry. Can you let me into the room? I got kicked out. Okay.
Just 1 second, sorry about that.
That's okay, you're fine. And can I share my screen?
You should be able to now.
You're a co-host, it says.
Yes. Great. You can see it? Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Arang Keshavarzian and Mozaffari for inviting me, and Karen Bourne and Dylan Szynski and Tess, I'm sorry, I don't know your last name. So nice to just met, but for managing the logistics of this talk. I want to talk to you about my book, The Color Black, Enslavement and Erasure in Iran, which is forthcoming with Duke University Press. And I want to start by sharing this document that was featured on the poster for this talk. So this document is held at the Yaz Document Center and Library, part of Sazmanaston Kitabkhane Milliye Iran, whose logo we can see right here on the right. And it's a very strange document. It has this faux marginal decoration. There are some flowers on it. And at the bottom, it says if this is an example of a wedding contract. So this marginal decoration is clearly fake. But even more interestingly for me, this document is not a wedding contract at all. There's no one getting married in this document. So someone took the time to decorate it. I don't know how long that took, but they decorated it without actually reading the document. And this is reflective of a lot of different types of erasures, wittingly or unwittingly, that are very normal for the history of slavery in Iran. So it's since been digitized and uploaded to the Women's World in Qajar, Iran Digital Archive that's held at Harvard. And the first 2 lines of the document say that this document is about a Black man named Salman, who was sold to a guy named Sayyid Abu Qasim. And so the Women's World in Qajar, Iran Archive at Harvard, which is obviously based outside of Iran and in the US, has it listed as a sales document. But it's not a sales contract. It's a document about the reconciliation between 2 individuals about the sale of an enslaved person, about the sale of Salman that had already taken place. This testimony is written in the first person, and in it, the person claimed that they hadn't received proper compensation. And so they wanted proper compensation for selling Salman, and it involves this long back and forth about how they came to settle. And a lump sum of money was exchanged just basically to end the complaints. So why did the National Archives create this fancy fake order and present it as a wedding contract? Well, the last line of the document has the phrase "Sireh Masaleh." which we can roughly translate to a vow of reconciliation. But Sida is normally used for marriage vows. And so whoever read it zeroed in on the last line of this document, said, oh, there's a Sida, this is a marriage document. It doesn't really make sense. It makes sense that they used it to refer to an agreement of reconciliation, right? A vow of reconciliation. But this is not a wedding contract. And so whoever looked at it said, great, this is a wedding contract, and they decorated it and presented it somewhere. This is sort of this is what I have to deal with researching slavery in Iran. We have to dig around and we find a lot of examples of erasure when looking at these documents. So let me just pause here and give some background on the history of enslavement in Iran. Elite and wealthy Iranians had for centuries enslaved peoples from around Iran, from the Caucasus, Central Asia, South Asia, and East Africa, in domestic spaces as nannies, wet nurses, eunuchs, cooks, and so on. They were, for the large part, examples and symbols of power and status. And there are also some examples of chattel slavery in the South, but my book is focused on enslaved peoples in these domestic roles in the South, but also in other major urban areas in Iran, because their presence and their gradual disappearance comes to shape much of the discourse on race and racism on a national scale. What's strange is that in the Iranian case, even though there are all these different types of people who were recognized as categorically enslavable in the 19th century, by the late 19th century, because of geopolitical shifts that I can talk about in the Q&A, there's a particular language of slavery that arises, where East Africans were racialized as exclusively Black, and Black was equivalent to slave, and that in turn shaped a specific type of anti-Blackness, a racism that is virulent, but after abolition in Iran would be actively denied and erased. So the first move towards the slave trade was in 1848. It was a decree banning, that's not what I'm trying to do. It was a decree banning the trafficking of enslaved people in the Persian Gulf ports. And about 70 years later, the Iranian parliament passed a law freeing all enslaved peoples in 1929, bringing the end of legal enslavement in Iran. And so these are two of the major dates that frame my book. But my research also looks at the legacies of enslavement at those erasures. So I look beyond the 1929 date to pretty much almost the present day. And so you can see how the first half of the book looks at the final period of legal enslavement, and the second half looks at the erasures and the afterlives of these erasures. But I do want to show that this isn't how my research started. So I started this project over 10 years ago because I knew that there were instances of enslavement within Iran. But whenever I asked anyone, be it regular Iranians or scholars or archivists, the response was very much, we didn't have slaves. Iranians didn't have slaves. We're not racist. You must be talking about the US. You are so American. But there was a history of enslavement. And I wanted to figure out what that history was, to the point where the original working title of my project was From Slave to Citizen, because I was interested in that very real transition from being enslaved to gaining legal status as an equal member of society after 1929. But as Christina Sharp has written, those of us who teach, write, and think about slavery and its afterlives encountered myriad silences and ruptures in time, space, history, ethics, and research as we do our work. And as I researched, I came up against more examples of those silences, more examples of those ruptures. And that's what pushed me to conceive of the book as one of two halves, first enslavement and then erasures. So not only was there a history of enslavement in Iran, this was a history that was intensely racialized throughout the 19th and 20th century, where Iranians had developed this precise vocabulary that entangled enslavement and race. And it was also a history that they tried to erase as quickly as possible after 1929, one that they replaced with alternate explanations and histories. And then denials of archivists and others are part of this longer history of this erasure. So my talk today focuses on examples from both sides of the book, from the first chapter, Geographies of Blackness and Enslavement, and the fourth chapter, Histories of a Country that Never Enslaved. So let's look at Geographies of Blackness and Enslavement. In 1856, Khizran was enslaved again. I say again because she'd already been enslaved once before, when she was born into enslavement in Zanzibar, and only found freedom when her first enslaver died when she was 13. But now Khizran was 22, a young woman who knew what freedom was like. One night, as her testimony tells us, she had been kidnapped from Zanzibar on her way home from a dance, and weeks later, she found herself in the Persian Gulf, sold to a man named Kamal who lived in Lenge. Khizron was forced to work inside Kamal's home. Kamal knew that the British were patrolling the Gulf to free enslaved people, and so he instructed Khizron not to leave the house. He didn't want them to see her. Her blackness was a visual marker of her enslavement, and Kamal didn't want to lose her to them. She had a friend though, and her friend told her that her enslavement was illegal. So once Kamal left for a trip to visit his family in Basra, Khizron went to the British for help. And after listening to her testimony, they agreed with her that her enslavement was illegal because in 1848, Iran had issued a royal decree that no one was to be trafficked or sold as enslaved via the Persian Gulf. The 1848 royal decree was the first push towards abolition in Iran, but I want to be clear that was a very lukewarm effort. The British had been pressuring Iran for years, and finally, on some random day in June of 1848, the British Charge d'Affaires wrote to Muhammad Shah Qajar's Grand Vizier saying, if it's the intention of the Persian government to issue this order, I request to be made acquainted with it today. The British government are very anxious to know. And so later that day, Muhammad Shah Qajar wrote this 4-line decree banning the import of enslaved peoples via the Persian Gulf. And they sent news of this decree to London, where it was received a few months later on September 6th. And the British higher-ups would write to Muhammad Shah Qajar thanking him for his important work, but it was too late. He had died the day before. And his teenage son, Nasir ad-Din, had become crowned as king, and he really did not care about the abolition of the slave trade, so the decree would be forgotten. A few years passed, and the British started to pressure the Iranian government to enforce the decree. The chief minister at the time, Amir Kabir, sent out this missive to the port cities. It's been commanded to the governors of the Persian Gulf ports, Khuzestan and Arabistan, that the citizens of the high government are forbidden from bringing siyah to the by sea, from the sea. This is a really interesting missive, not only because it shows how this decree was being enforced, or not enforced rather, but actually Amir Kabir used the singular noun for the color black to refer to the people who were being smuggled into Iran. This is the earliest example I found of the color black being used as a noun and not an adjective to refer to people. Because the use of the adjective black it's pretty old in Persian. We have centuries worth of poetry where there are examples like Zangi-Siyah, the black Zanzibari, or Hindu-Siyah, the black Indian. And this was regardless of their free or unfree status. But now you suddenly have the ability to say the Siyah, the black, and it refers to an individual. Or in the case of Amir Kabir, black refers to an undefined number of people who are not only dark-skinned, but also enslaved. So this is when blackness comes to be the main signifier of enslavement in Iran. And this is the backdrop against which Khizron, a black woman from Zanzibar, sought her freedom. So when Khizron first went to the British, she met a representative, Mullah Ahmad, who took down her testimony. He agreed with her that her enslavement was illegal, so he arranged for her to be sent to the Freed People's Depot by boat. And a few days later, as she was waiting for this boat, Khizron showed up at Mullah Ahmad's office again, this time with a 13-year-old boy she had run into on the streets of Lenge. She introduced him as Walidi, and she said that he had been smuggled into Iran as the same ship as her. So Mullah Ahmad listened, and he again agreed that the boy should be freed as well, and together they're sent to the depot. And so they're there, they're waiting for their free papers, and everything is smooth until the British found out that the boy had been enslaved by a big sheikh in Waristan, which was over 100 miles north of Lenge. The sheikh threatened the British, and the British folded so quickly. They forced Walidi back into enslavement, even though Khizron had given them the information about when they had arrived, on which ship, and what the name of their trader was. The British were not interested, and they even fired Mullah Ahmad, who had granted them their free papers in the first place. So we know about Khizron's story because of extensive British documentation, the work of scholars, and the work of scholars including Nyambi Kakioli and Anthony Lee. During the 19th century, the British Empire really used abolition to distract from its political goals. They cloaked their imperialist efforts as abolitionists and therefore morally good. And so they presented themselves as champions of anti-slavery. And the British archives reflect this. There are just boxes and boxes of files on abolition, tens of thousands of documents. And a lot of these files focus on the Persian Gulf slave trade. And so this creation of papers around abolition was part of this performance of abolition. But anyone who looks through these files knows that the British regularly prioritized strategic choices over the lives of the enslaved. And this is so obvious in the case of Khizran and Waladi, where the British not only keep the testimonies, they also keep all the letters detailing how they've decided to send Waladi back into enslavement. And it was a very quick decision. It was not something they mulled over for long. But despite this commitment to creating paperwork, the papers only tell us so much about the enslaved people that they were supposedly helping. So I want to read a short section from my book where I think through some of this. Did Khizran pronounce her own name as 2 syllables? Or was it pronounced Khizaron, only to be transliterated as Khizran by the British office's English translator, who was unfamiliar with the vowelization of her name? Similarly, the letters and missives refer to the young boy as Waladi. Was this the name his enslaver gave him, or maybe a surname? But Waladi is not a typical name, but rather my son. Perhaps this was due to a translation error. Perhaps Khizran had introduced him as Waladi, or maybe as a term of endearment, and the transcriber and translator assumed it was his name. Or is it possible that their ages were listed incorrectly? Maybe Khizran was not 22 years old, or maybe Waladi was not yet 13, and Waladi was a literal relational designation. He is my son. If Waladi was enslaved by a sheikh in Laristan, what was he doing in Lenge? Had Khizran sent for him, or had she come across him by accident? Or had Waladi also figured out that his enslavement was illegal, leading him to venture out hundreds of miles and find the British office for his freedom? Our questions about the lives of Khizran and Waladi are endless, but like many other testimonies now held at the British archives, they remain unanswered. The most trying of these questions is whether Khizran was also sent back to Kemal, her enslaver, and were Khizran and Waladi ever reunited? The paper trail on them disappears. Despite these inconsistencies, Khizran's testimony and the subsequent dealings with Waladi's enslavement reveal the kind of details the British bureaucracy was interested in. Khizran's testimony, a little over a page long, is formulaic in its structure, and it mimics the other thousands of similar biographies taken from enslaved peoples from across the Persian Gulf seeking freedom at the British offices between the 1850s until the 1940s, either in Bushehr in southern Iran or in other port cities of the Gulf, such as Sharjah or Muscat. They begin with the heading Statement by Name and Age. Sometimes the date is included, other times it is not. The testimony, written as a first-person narrative, then begins with the individual's personal and family history, typically referring to details about where they were born, who their parents were, how they were enslaved, who enslaved them, what their treatment was like, and finally, how they arrived at the agency and their request for a manumission certificate. Many, as Hopper notes, reveal a precise knowledge of the geography of their homelands. And while some scholars have regarded these records as being in their own voices, i.e. in the voices of the enslaved, the archival records are all in English, summarized translations from interviews likely taken in Persian and Arabic or Swahili. What is lost in these translations, we do not know. Given the uniformity of these testimonies, we can assume any details not considered germane were excluded from the official transcriptions. Moreover, the testimonies taken for the bureaucratic machine of the British offices lack references to emotive details, such as their appearance, their emotional state, their comportment, their dress. Was Khizran calm as she advocated for herself and later again for Waladi? Had Waladi cried when he realized that he would be re-enslaved? But it's these papers that allow us to know about Khizran's story. So even though the British were taking down all of these testimonies, it was really more about their ability to show how much work they're doing in the Persian Gulf to free all these people. Despite these decisions that were dangerous to the very people they were claiming to save, and despite not being able to get all these details correctly, the production and preservation of these sources as anti-slavery efforts became integral to the narrative that the British singularly championed abolition. And that's because the motivations behind the abolition of slavery were not necessarily humanitarian, but rather political. So Matthew Hopper has also written on this, that sometimes, or oftentimes, freed slaves were shipped to other ports for their freedom, where they were almost guaranteed to die. And yet it was these efforts that singularly targeted those who were Black to both give them their freedom, but to also racialize them as not only Black, but also enslaved. Oh, I never showed that line. So this is the vowelization. So Iranians knew this. They knew that it was harder to enslave people via the Persian Gulf, and so they started to outmaneuver the British completely. They would sometimes travel to the Arabian Peninsula, do pilgrimage in Mecca and Medina, and purchase an enslaved individual all in one trip. In 1886, when the diplomat Mirza Muhammad Farahani had returned from his pilgrimage to Mecca, Nasruddin Shah asked him to compose a travelogue of his journey. The travelogue was intended as a guide. It included things like currency or like climate. But he also included a breakdown of enslaved people for sale in the Meccan bazaar. He provided an explicitly racist ranking of the enslaved women standing on benches of 3 different tiers. Top tier, women with olive skin. Then the middle tier, and then the bottom tier, where they are very black, kheli siyah. He goes on to say, most of them, and here he's describing the people he described as very black. Whoa, what am I doing? Most of whom were brought to Iran, where people like us are willing to own them. Male slaves are cheap, good eunuchs, young and old, can be obtained there. Thus, the wife of Ali al-Mulk, who I heard had come back to Mecca this year, bought a young eunuch for 200 toman and took him back. Transporting them by sea is a source of trouble and dispute. So his racist categorization of enslaved East Africans reveals something about both the logistics and the attitudes towards the slave trade, intentionally and unintentionally. So I want to reiterate that this is intended for the Shah. This is intended for the literal person who is responsible for enforcing these abolition treaties. This is for a royal audience. But instead, Farahani was explaining to them something they already knew, that it was getting harder to enslave and traffic people into Iran, that they could circumvent the British, and that they were explicitly looking for Black people to enslave. And so this is a map of Farahani's own route. And the travelogue doesn't say if he had purchased someone to enslave on this particular trip. And there are other reasons for this route, but you can see that he doesn't deal with the Persian Gulf at all. So it would take a few more decades until enslavement was declared illegal in Iran. The Manumission Law of 1929 banned the trafficking of enslaved peoples into Iran and freed anyone who remained enslaved within Iran's borders. And this law was a rushed process. It was only voted on because Reza Shah's cabinet just thought it was so embarrassing that Iran still had legal slavery on the books. So they passed it, they made a big show of it, they printed it on the front page of the newspaper. But within a few years, they very quickly started to erase any remnants of slavery in Iran, from tearing down buildings to peddling narratives that Cyrus the Great freed all the slaves. And I'm happy to talk more about these examples in the Q&A, but for now, I wanted to focus on 2 specific examples about how these erasures were so deep that they not only obfuscate this history, but they also erase it and rewrite it completely. So the Manumission Law in 1929 used barde, the catch-all term for slave, to free all of those who remained enslaved in Iran. But if you ask Iranians today, if you ask some of them at least, they will tell you that Iran never had barde, that barde is something that existed in the US. How did this happen? Well, in the 1930s, Ali Akbar Dehkhoda embarked on a new project. He was compiling the first and most comprehensive modern dictionary of Persian, the Lughatnameh. The Lughatnameh remains a useful reference for Persian. It pairs dictionary definitions with quotes, lines of poetry, and other textual examples of each word's application. It was a gargantuous task, and Dehkhoda passes away before it was complete. In 1958, 2 years after Dehkhoda's death, his partner Mohammad Moin released a new edition of the dictionary, and this edition had a detailed definition of bardagi, the state of being enslaved, in Persian. So a lot of these entries in the Lughatnameh have explanations and quotes and lines of poetry, but the entry for bardagi is unique in how extensive it is. So you can see that this is one word, but this is the definition for bardagi. It goes on longer than a column. It starts with slavery in ancient Mesopotamia, goes on, talks about the US Civil War, and it ends by talking about the 1926 Geneva Convention on Slavery, saying that it ended enslavement worldwide. This is ironic because Iran abolishes slavery 3 years later in 1929. So the definition is cited as taken from the Persian encyclopedia, from Da'iratul Ma'arif, and it makes no mention of Iran. So in the single most authoritative source on the Persian language, and this is still the definition that we use today, if you use Vajaya, it makes no reference to Iran. Enslavement was defined as a global phenomenon that existed everywhere else, especially in the Americas, but not in Iran. So even though the dictionary cites the Persian encyclopedia as its source, the Persian encyclopedia had copied its definition from another source, the 1953 edition of the Columbia Viking Desk Encyclopedia. The Persian encyclopedia was published by the Iranian government press, and the editor refrained from implicating Iran in its definition, even though the Iranian government itself had used the same term for slave, barda, in its 1929 law. So this dictionary definition starts to reflect a myth that Iranians would come to believe, that enslavement was not an Iranian problem. And soon barda would be turned on its head. It stops being this catch-all term for slavery, and instead starts to exclusively refer to chattel forms of enslavement, especially that you would have found on US plantations. So let me share another example of how a royally hosted art exhibit redefined it in even more concrete terms. In 1977, the Introduction to the Art of Black Africa exhibition was held in Tehran. It was sponsored by Farahdibo's Foundation, Farabi University, National Iranian Radio and Television, and it featured pieces on loan from museums representing 14 countries in West or Central Africa. The exhibition included wooden masks like this one, but also statues, ornamental objects, hair combs, staffs, swords, and other wood-carved objects. For 6 weeks, from November 1st to December 16th in 1977, people could visit mornings and afternoons to see them at Baba Ferdos. So the exhibition was a big deal. Farahdibo herself described it at the opening event, that this exhibition was the first of its kind outside of Africa. The honorary committee had both Iranian and African officials and ambassadors, and the catalogs were printed in multiple languages, one specifically in both French and English, so you know that they envisioned this international audience for it. A lot of big names were involved, obviously not just Farahdibo, who's the queen, but also, for example, Parviz Tanavoli, the famous artist known for his heat sculptures. There were others involved as well. So the exhibition catalog talks about the Atlantic slave trade at length, and how European colonialism depleted the continent of its riches. You can see here it talks about how the relations have greatly expanded in recent years, and we're pleased to see that our capital has become the meeting place of a strong, flourishing, and living culture of Black Africa with Iran's own rich culture. The closest it comes to referencing any history that connected Iran to Africa is a single sentence, that Zanzibar and other places, quote, exported slaves to Arabia, unquote. Exported. No mention of Iran. And the slaves in Arabia, quote, builds on a trope that had emerged in the early 20th century, that Iran's slavery problem wasn't because Iranians wanted to enslave anyone, it was because Arab slave traders just kept smuggling enslaved peoples into Iran. But now we see an updated version of this. Arab slave traders only enslave people within the Arab world, not Iran. And this is less than 50 years after the Manumission Law, 1929 to 1977. So it's even more ironic if you sit back and realize, wow, they hosted this exhibition in the 19th century palace. Baba Ferdos, the Garden of Paradise, was first built by Muhammad Shah Qajar back when he ruled from 1834 to 1848. It was never finished under his rule, and his son Nasiruddin Shah inherited it and gifted it to his daughter as a wedding gift. And the princess's husband was an architect, so he builds out this palatial structure, and they held their wedding reception there, which was dubbed the most expensive wedding in Iran at the time. So we can be sure, without any doubt, that this ceremony was carried out by the Qajar family's many, many attendants, which included enslaved East Africans. As years passed, Baba Ferdos continued to be exchanged between royals who either neglected the structure or expanded it. Ultimately, though, it proved to be too much for private ownership. And this was true for many Qajar homes of elite families. When the 19th century saw a boom in the construction of these sprawling compounds, most of them were abandoned after 1929. So these huge compounds, and I mean, Baba Ferdos is several stories tall with many rooms. They would have been built with specific areas to house an entire fleet of enslaved labor and servants. But without forced labor, without slavery, these structures were too hard for them to maintain. And so by the 1970s, many of them had been converted to museums, as Baba Ferdos was used for the Introduction to the Art of Black Africa exhibit. And today it's home to Tehran's Cinema Museum. So not only is this exhibition claiming to be the first to introduce the entire continent of Africa to Iran, it's doing so in a space that once used enslaved African labor to maintain its upkeep. And so we can see how archives and museum projects can not only obfuscate their collections, but the very structure that they operate out of can contribute to that project of erasure as well. So we have a poster. So one of the things that's been really important for me in this book was not only mining these sources for their information to reconstruct as much of the lives of the enslaved as possible, but thinking through the kinds of contexts that they were constructed in and why we even have them preserved for us to think about today, be it textural or architectural or visual. Not only was the history of enslavement in Iran intensely racialized and politically motivated in the 19th and 20th centuries, the preservation of that history and its erasure has been racialized and political as well. In Iran, it was a history that they tried to forget. They erected an alternate history, a fantasy, one where Iran and Africa never met, never interacted, not until polite diplomats had exchanged pretty objects for the sake of a greater shared culture. And it's that narrative that I wanted to counter in my book, and I hope I've done a little bit of that for you today. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.
I'm getting shorter every year. When I go next to a lecture. I think I've said this to you before. You don't know how happy I am and relieved that you produced a study on the history of slavery in Iran that does not pussyfoot around the question of race and specifically Blackness. Credit goes to your scholarship and your progressive social awareness. I have some historiographic comments to make, and then I have several questions. As many of you know, we've been between a rock and a hard place from a historiographical point of view in the study of slavery in our area. I mean, the Middle East in general and Iran specifically. In my generation, when we were graduate students and even much later, we had studies that were marred by colonial and Orientalist preconceptions and prejudgments. According to C.J. Wills, the slaves in Persia have what Americans call a good time. Well-fed, well-clothed, treated as spoiled children, given the lightest work, and often given in marriage to a favorite son or taken as a concubine by the master himself. Sounds like real fun. Somehow, having skipped over the lack of awareness of the cultures of the enslaved, the violent traumas of enslavement, the trials and difficulties of the Middle Passage, travel under very difficult circumstances on foot, in difficult terrain, not enough food, abusive treatment by slave traders, to the humiliating market and sale experience, and finally to the conditions of their lives in homes or armies or farms or bazaars, where their minds and bodies were abused on a daily basis. Not so much fun, my friend. In many studies on slavery in the Middle East, we have also degrees of religious defensiveness and or justification. Some Western studies relied only on religious and legal texts, focusing on what has been called the Islamic slave trade. Note that very few refer to the transatlantic slave trade as the Christian slave trade. As Clarence Smith points out, the subject of slavery produces anxiety for most religions. Muslims try to condemn slavery and spare Islam. For example, in the preface of Narges Alipour's very valuable volume of documents on the slave trade in Iran, an Islamist official states that what we had in Iran was not bardagi or slavery. It was bandagi, servitude. Bardagi is associated with the Atlantic especially American slavery, as Beeta observes. And bandegi is not as nasty because the bande has a soul and can be manumitted. Most Jews deny any role in the slave trade and slave ownership, but everyone was involved, and no religion condemned slavery outright. Once the abolitionist movement took root in Britain, religious arguments were used to condemn slavery, but racism did not go away, and in many cases, indentured labor took the place of slave labor among the so-called freed slaves in colonies controlled by the British around the world. Tom Ricks points to the construction of shipyards in various parts of India at the same time that, excuse me, slave manumission was a part of British imperial policy. Beeta also correctly points out that it suited the British to use abolitionist arguments to further their political aims and their control over the Persian Gulf. Now, the manumission law of, sorry, can I have water? Thank you so much. The manumission law of 1921, visions of an Iranian modernity and identity were crafted, which denied the very existence of slavery, never mind the maltreatment of slaves or racism. Though we didn't have slaves, we had servants, and they were part of the family narrative, is still very prevalent in Iran. Even Behnaz Mirzai's book, which is the first book in English on the history of slavery in Iran in the 19th and early 20th centuries, takes the position that racist terms like kaka were terms of intimacy, like translated as brother, and that racism was not a major factor in the history of slavery, although we know that kaka refers to a Black person and therefore connected to enslavement. Fortunately, the approaches have changed in recent scholarship, and scholars are considering the questions of race and racism in the explanation of trends, patterns, and realities of the institution of slavery over time. Whereas the history of slavery has been more extensively and better studied so far for the Ottoman Empire and North Africa, studies on Iran began to improve with the work of Tom Ricks, Willem Floor, Vanessa Martin, and Anthony Lee, and improved exponentially with the new generation of scholars like Beeta Baghoolizadeh, Wendy D'Souza, and Parisa Vaziri, and with the establishment of organizations such as the Collective for Black Iranians. I'm going to ask Beeta to tell us a little bit more about this collective in the Q&A time. Regarding sources, in the 1880s, there was a survey of Isfahan by Mirza Hussein Khan, which includes that there existed an association of male and female slaves. These local sources, which Beeta uses in her argument, show that there was a large presence of slaves in Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, Kerman, and Mashhad, among other places. We need to further investigate these local resources and sources. And I'm going to start with a question here. In your research, did you come across other censuses aside from the 1868 one, or surveys with different categories? In this Isfahan survey, there's a category of white slaves. Some were remnants or offspring of the Caucasian slaves, but who were the others? The children of poor Iranians who were sold in lieu of taxes, maybe Indians, Afghans, Turkmen, Baluchis, Makranis. These were also included in enslavement. When discussing the transformation from the usage of ethnic terms or regional labels, such as Bombasi, Somali, Zangi, Habashi, to racial geography, in other words, the usage of Black for all of them, are you saying that regional terms did not continue to be used, but for the very racist reasons of pricing in the sale of slaves? In other words, Habashis were less Black and more expensive. according to your research, and I've written these questions for you, so you don't, according to your research, is there any evidence of slaves working on land or in workshops in the bazaar? In my research, there's a considerable presence of slaves, Black and other enslaved peoples in the bazaar. The ownership of Black slaves was a symbol of status and success, thus their presence in the public sphere, as Beeta points out. But there's another category of Black presence in the public sphere, in the public space, slaves who were manumitted or their masters had died, or they had simply escaped. They wandered the streets and tried to make money by becoming workers or entertainers. And this is where I suspect Haji Firuz and the theater genre of Siyahbazi can be traced to. I think she deals with this in a chapter which we didn't get. So erasure and the factors that made it possible. In the Reza Shah period, a new vision of modernity and identity developed, which included the revisionist narrative of Ma ba'd nadashti, we did not have slaves. The manumission law of 1929 allowed for the disappearance of freed Black people from urban areas. Even having birth certificates, Iranian citizenship, and first and last names did not prevent this erasure. Out of all these machinations, the Aryan myth, the Cyrus cylinder, emerged the narrative that slavery was a foreign phenomenon and non-Iranians were enslaving people, as you point out. Nod, wink, Arab traders, and that there were no Black people in Iran. This narrative that enslavement and racism was an American problem, with Malcolm X as Bilal as the ideal Black man, became conveniently adopted and adapted to the Islamist discourse since the revolution, because the US was the culprit and it worked out fine, and Islam was the savior of Black people. But during Mohammad Reza Shah's rule, when this narrative was developed, it is ironic and that the nasty racist image of the US could be allowed to be perpetuated, considering how close the Shah was to the US and how much American society was idealized in Iran. So my question is, how do you explain these parallel and conflicting images of the US? And my last question is, did the same kind of erasure take place in Turkey after their manumission law? I think it was Kemal Atatürk, and also in the Arab countries. Was there erasure of Blackness or racism? Thank you.
I think it would be a shame for not to give you a chance to reflect on some of the thoughtful comments and questions that Nahid presented. So maybe 5 minutes, Beeta, to pick up some of those threads, and then we'll have a chance to open it up to the floor as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for reading my work so carefully. And this is our second time reading my work so carefully, so I feel really grateful to have you to discuss it. Where do I even begin? First of all, this is so helpful. We should just do this more often. Let me start. Well, the last question is actually, can you tell us more about the Collective for Black Iranians? So let me start there. The Collective for Black Iranians, it was a collective that was started in 2020. It started in August of 2020, and it was led by a group of Black and Afro-Iranians who are based in the US, Canada, Europe, and Iran. And it started out on an Instagram platform, and they've done other things as well. But they really wanted to change this idea that there are no Black people in Iran. And part of the collective was in the works, but during the George Floyd protests, there were all these conversations happening in Persian that were maybe well-meaning, but they actually ended up regurgitating a lot of different types of racist information. And so they created this collective to counter these narratives, right? And the founder, Priscilla Hoveda, asked me to be their resident historian. So actually the story of Prizren, I worked with an artist, Mina Jafari, and we illustrated the story. And it was actually like semi-animated on BBC Persian. So that's the work of the collective. And I did a Meredith interview with Priscilla that you guys can find on my website, which apparently is well navigatable. So these are really interesting questions. I'll take two from each chapter. So the first one, where you asked about the 1868 census. So this was a census in 1868. Nasruddin Shah asked Najmuddin, can you please figure out the population of Tehran? And they have all these different categories for occupation and marital status and like gender or sex. And so one of the categories is Black slaves, enslaved Black men and enslaved Black women, Kanizasiya, Ghulamsiya. And there's no attempt to count the non-Black slaves. And Thomas Ricks does this thing where he adds up all the numbers, and there's a discrepancy of about 1,000 people who were not categorized in these smaller categories, but they're included in the total population. So he suggests that this is probably the Caucasian slaves. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to just be the people who were enslaved from the Caucasus, but also you have it listed here: children of poor Iranians, Indians, Afghans, Turkmen. I don't know if Baluchis and Makaronis would have been included in that, because as time goes on, they start to be, as it's harder to enslave East Africans, they start to sort of be counted as Black, which is I think so. Maybe don't quote me on this. This is being recorded. Don't quote me on that. But that's my guess, because it returns back to the South Asian use of it. And then similarly, you're asking about the regional labels of Bombasi, Somali, Zangi, Habashi. It just becomes less common for them to be used as these terms. I'm not saying it disappears entirely, but they supplant Bombasi, Somali, and Zangi with Siya. That becomes much more common. Habashi, as you noted, stays part of the parlance for much longer, to the point where today you won't hear, if I'm asking someone about Baghoolizadeh or Kaniz Ghulam, they won't bring up Bombasi, Somali, Zangi, but they'll bring up Habashi. It still is in part of the sort of the remnants that have remained, if we find the right people to talk to, right? So the other question I want to answer all of them, but the other question I want to answer right now is that, of course, there's evidence, as you said, of people working in the bazaar. I've just focused on the domestic space because it would have been too unwieldy for me to attempt everything, but also I found that the domestic space starts to really reflect what's happening at the royal court, and people are emulating the royal court as much as they can, and that's why I argue that this starts to change this nationalist discourse on race, the national discourse, not nationalist, national discourse on race and racism, because either people are copying them outright, copying the Bazaar court, or they have this aspirations of copying them. So we have examples of families who hire free women who are Black, with the sort of attempt at showing off that they have someone who's enslaved in their household. But the person's not enslaved, they're paid and they're a servant. But because Blackness becomes a signifier for enslavement, it starts to be a part of a discourse that they can really buy into. So the question about Haji Firuz and the people becoming workers or entertainers. Yeah, Haji Firuz, I talk about this not only in chapter 5, but also in chapter 3, where I'm talking about eunuchs. Because at the Bazaar court, where you have Karim Shirei, and people recognize Karim Shirei as the father of comedy in Iran, he had a troupe, and in it included free free Black men. We don't know if they were formerly enslaved or how they came to be, but there are Black men in his troop, and they would mock, they would use them, or they would use masks to mock the eunuchs at the Qajar court. And this is why you have this sort of understanding that Haji Firuz speaks in Pidgin Persian. He has a high-pitched voice. He's literally a court jester. That's how they're presenting him, which is part of the mockery, because a lot of people who have written on eunuchs have noted that they had a lot of status and they had a lot of power. But these jokes showed that, well, at the end of the day, you're still enslaved, right? The sort of character of Haji Firuz, I don't think becomes canonized, so to speak, in Iranian culture until the 1950s. But Siyah Bazi as a theater, you start to see it really become a full-fledged thing in the early 20th century. And then especially after the abolition of slavery, there are no Black performers doing Siyah Bazi anymore, blackface theater anymore. It is Iranians who are non-Black who are painting their faces. But in Sadi Afshar's memoir, and Sadi Afshar was a famous playing blackface theater actor, he says that he learned from people who had learned from a generation that would sneak into the Qajar court, see how the eunuchs were acting, come back out and mock them on the streets. So there's this very direct transition of how Siyah Bazi comes to be. But people who have defended Siyah Bazi have defended it as this ancient tradition, that Haji Firuz is Zoroastrian, somehow he's a Mobad. It feels very offensive to Zoroastrianism, actually.
He hangs around fire, so that's why his face.
Fire, yes. Yeah. And then the last question that I'm going to answer, this racist image of the US, that's actually the topic of the AHR article that's supposed to come out soon, where Iranians became very interested and invested in what was happening in the US during the civil rights movement. And it became this very common, it became common knowledge. The newspapers, especially Etila'at, did a lot of work to educate people on what was happening in the US. They would have these tracts after Malcolm X's assassination. They would have these tracts of explaining who Malcolm X was, who was Marcus Garvey, and would translate parts of the autobiography that had been published in, I want to say, the Observer. And so they were doing this translation of the autobiography before it was even published, right? And they were sort of educating the population about what was going on. And that became such a big deal that it became part of the common parlance, to the point where Marjan Sachafi's Persepolis, she, that scene where she's like pretending that she's not listening to rock music and the Gasht Ershad have stopped her. She says, this isn't Michael Jackson, this is Malcolm X, part of the Muslim Brotherhood in the US, or something like that. So to the point where this is what she's trying to use as a teenage girl to get out of Gasht Ershad from the morality police from arresting her. So that's there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So we have plenty of time for questions. We'll start with the audience. Those of you on Zoom, you can type up your questions, and we'll try our best to get to them. Please raise your hand. Maybe it's good to introduce yourself in one sentence so we get to know you. Is that Ian? We'll get them one by one.
My name is Mozaffari. I work here.
This is
As a
actually
follow-up to your response to your last question, it was actually government policy to highlight racism in the US. For instance, there was a sort of official journal of Pahlavi estate, Bunyad, that Ashraf Pahlavi Bunyad published that. This was published for only 2 years, ended with revolution. in almost all issues of this journal, racism and the struggle against racism of all sorts is represented and or through translations or writings by Iranians. I can also tell you from my personal experience, during those years, I was a student at Tehran University, and we had a student journal, and we had someone who government trusted who would, oversee what we published. And that was one of the issues that we had published, and this person who was a professor there, but he was trusted by the government, basically met with us and said, well, there is so much about Palestine and Vietnam and those kind of things. And we said, well, but you want us not to criticize the US? He said, no, criticize the US on racism, but don't get into these sensitive areas. And he at least implied that he has been told that we have free check in writing about racism in the US, but not about other things that US is.
Amazing.
That's so interesting.
I'm going to start on this, Aisha.
Hi, my name is Aisha. I also work here. Thank you. Thank you, Beeta. This was so informative. And I have two questions and a comment about the very last question that Nahid asked about. Is this similar to Turkey? I'm not an expert on slavery on Turkey, but I have some words to say. But my question is about this linking the word Black to African enslavement. And my first question is that what happened to the Caucasian slaves after that? You mentioned that in the census there was a gap of 1,000 people, and according to some scholars it might be the Caucasian or non-Black slaves, but is there any other or have been any other place where you are actually able to see or track, because we know that there were also non-Black slaves, so what happened to that part of slavery? That's the question. And the other one, again, linking the word Black to slave, what happened, or have you seen any examples where, let's say, a very dark-skinned Indian who is in Iran as a merchant, taken as a slave and getting in trouble and trying to prove that he is not slave, even though he has a dark skin that can be confused as Black, when Black, the word siyah, is really the word means enslaved people. And the comment that I want to say, this Ma berdegine dashtim, is very similar in Turkey, right? We all say that, oh, we didn't have slaves. We only had like servants. And of course, the Americans had that, and our servants were part of the family because we all had domestic slaves. And there's actually no law in modern Turkey that abolished slavery officially. It kind of faded out, and there have been some references to the Tanzimat period in the mid-19th century that made everybody equal before the law, that regardless of their race and ethnicity and religion. But there was really no, like, I was surprised to see that 1929, the official law that abolished it. So that is the difference. But the cultural, the erasure part is very, very similar. That now there's also scholarship emerging, as you know, from others doing that part of the story in Turkey, in the Turkish historical context. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so in Iran, by the mid to late 19th century, the trafficking of Caucasians became very difficult, to the point where you really don't see many instances of Caucasians being enslaved anymore. And this is because of the Russian Empire in the north. The Russian Empire, if any Caucasians were enslaved, they could go to the Russian embassy for their freedom in Tehran, and so that would happen. But you have a few enslaved Caucasians at the Qajar court, but they are never racialized as Safid. That doesn't happen for them. And there's no noun that you could use to describe them. It would have to be Kaniza Cherkesi, right, a Circassian girl, enslaved girl, or Kaniza Qahbazi or Khaja Qahbazi, a Caucasian eunuch or a Caucasian enslaved girl. And that's because you start having this sort of Aryan myth arise where because enslavement becomes so associated with Blackness, and before Iranians sort of saw themselves as in between Blackness and whiteness, or stuff those were two terms that happened that were applied outside of Iran for people outside of Iran. Suddenly they were like, well, where's Sefid? You know, where are Ariyai? And so Sefid never gets that sort of noun. And you don't hear it in Persian parlance until like very recently amongst diaspora kids, where they would use it as like white people, and they're translating that from English, right? And I mean very specifically like Iranian Americans of my generation, maybe slightly older, but you don't have that in Iran at all at that period. So that's that. And then were there instances of Indians? I haven't come across it. And the one example of an enslaved South Asian person I found, for example, at the Qajar court, they're not described as Siyah, they're described as Zafirani, as saffron colored. And so that's the only example I've come across. And the sort of example you've given, I've read about that kind of story with like free Black women who are then kidnapped and sold into slavery. But I haven't come across it with Indians, although there are like, that's still happening to South Asians, like in the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. I haven't seen an example of it. I'm not saying it didn't happen.
Can I just have a follow-up question? So, I mean, you nicely illustrate how Siyah becomes attached to enslaved person. But Ghulam and Kaniz, these terms, do they become synonymous with Blackness? Does it work? Does the argument work the other way too, or you're not making that argument? No, yeah. If you said like, yeah, if there are sales contracts that imply that the person is Black and they're just saying Kaniz, right? So you don't need to say Siyah when you're using that Ghulam. Yes, but that happens really, really late. And so like you see examples of that in marriage contracts, right? Where part of the dowry becomes like one Kaniz, and they don't mean someone who's Caucasian, like that would have been impossible. So they're just referring to an enslaved Black person. You have examples of free Black people being called Kaniz or Ghulam and them having to sort of assert their freedom or escape to freedom, right? So it does sort of work both ways. I'm sorry.
Hi, my name's Ali. I don't work here. But thank you so much. This is a topic I've always been interested in learning about, and I didn't really know much. Actually, the first time I heard about it, I was in Kenya, and somebody there told me about it. And I wanted to ask you a question about something he told me. I want to fact check it, I guess, or get if you could elaborate on it. He was telling me about how the reason there's not a big population of Africans in the Middle East is because the males were all or almost all eunuchs, whereas in the U.S. they weren't. And one, I want to know if that's the reason why, and then two, if in a way you view that as maybe like a harsher form of slavery actually than what was in the West, because they actually didn't have the opportunity to have a family, whereas in the West, I mean, obviously it was not good either way, but just how do you do that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So this idea that there weren't many or were many, this is like subjective, right? Because if you go to southern Iran, there is a significant Black population. The reasons though are different because inheritance works differently, and inheritance and slave status worked differently in Iran. At least it was supposed to. There are definitely examples where it was sidestepped, but you had a lot of enslaved Black women working in families where they were sexually vulnerable to the enslaver, right? And so whether it was instances of sexual assault or rape, or if they had wanted to establish some sort of sexual relation for getting higher status or freedom, that's debated in the historiography. But you have a lot of children who are born to these women, and those women would have inherited, those children would have inherited their father's status. And so the examples that I was mentioning earlier about like a free Black person being like, I'm free, like you cannot enslave me. A lot of them were children of these relationships who were still coded as Black, but actually had their father's free status. You do have a significant population of castrated eunuchs in Tehran, especially at the royal court, and other very elite families who could have afforded that, the sale prices of eunuchs, because they were sold for more, right? Because it's such a hard surgery. Like, first of all, it's terrifying and horrifying, but also a lot of children didn't survive, right? So you did see a lot of eunuchs at the royal court, but there were enslaved Black men who were not castrated in a lot of families. And so as these treaties start to pick up, like I found examples of the contracts that are supposed to be marriage contracts, but it says, you know, Yahut Gholam is a free man. We've given him his freedom, but we are going to give him in marriage to a very pretty enslaved Black woman, and their children will be enslaved in our family. So that is like antithetical to Islamic law, right? That's antithetical to the traditions of the region surrounding slavery, but they really didn't care, right? This racism was so pervasive, and there's this desperation to hold on to that status, that this was how they were propagating and maintaining that status. So yeah, after abolition in 1929, another reason why some people might say that, you know, there's not a big presence or that they don't really exist is a lot of families, the way they dealt with freeing their enslaved members of the family is marrying them to someone within their family. And so that way they sort of stayed in this subservient position, but not legally so, right? So legally it looks like you have this happy marriage, but I mean, in the home, if it's domestic servitude, it starts to replicate itself.
Yevon, you had your hand up earlier. I don't know, I had you on the list, but you.
Well, just a comment and a question. To Andy's remark about that the official policy of the regime was anti-racism, anti-imperialism. Like much of the regime, it was actually hypocritical, because what the Shah was also doing at the same time was financing the apartheid regime in South Africa at the time when there was fighting on in Rhodesia and Angola. So there was a lot of Shah's money flowing there. So at one hand, the public appearance was anti-racism, but it was actually privately supporting the apartheid regime. But one question I had was, you use a lot of the Foreign Office materials. Has anyone in Iran looked at basically Sharia court systems that the judges would use the stuff as private documents? They would be preserved in their private homes or maybe given to libraries. There would be a lot of cases there about the disputes about enslavement.
Yeah, I mean, some of them have gone into the National Archives in Iran. It's just hard to find them. But I have seen examples of these sorts of, I mean, the first document I showed you, I think, is one of those documents, right? That's coming out of a sort of agreement that they are settling now because they've had these people acting as intermediaries and they've come to a resolution. As for private collections of them, I don't know if I have. Have you?
No, a lot of slaves would not go to the Sharia court to complain about their treatment because they weren't pretty sure that the court would not be supported. I mean, I think the Sharia court system were fully cooperative with the rulers and the institution of slavery. That's why I made those comments about religion, that according to Islamic law, you could have slaves, but you're supposed to treat them well. And so this poor slave possibly could not prove that he wasn't treated well. In any case, I haven't seen very much evidence of them going to Sharia courts to complain. There would be cases where people would complain about like money and having sold the slave and not,
Yeah.
But it would be useful to go look further and further.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have Lalajan and Lewis, and lots of hands are popping up. Okay, so maybe should we collect a couple that way? So Lalajan and Lewis, and I see the hands in the back. We'll get to you in a moment. So let's start with two first.
Thank you, Beeta, for this talk. I'm really looking forward to reading the book when it's out. My question is about status, which you talked a lot about the idea of the slave owners having status that relates to having the Black slave, or even the idea of like hiring a free person who is Black, but then pretending that they're a slave, right? So can you say a little bit more about the development of that, the status that's attached to that ownership? Is it in relation to the difficulty of obtaining a Black slave? Like, is it, is it something that you've traced over the 19th, like how that status relationship emerges? Like, I'm thinking in terms of like in Turkey, where there are like trends of domestic laborers, right? And there was like a period in which not slaves, but
Right.
like people, it's like very trendy for people to have like Moldovans that were working for them, and then like other kinds of, so I can see but like what was happening and at what point did this become a sort of like the status related enterprise?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I'm sorry. We're collecting. Okay.
Like one more.
I'm Louis, I'm a student here. Quickly, I apologize if you touched on this, I missed the first bit of the talk. You mentioned Blackness, and one thing I realized coming to college and meeting people who aren't American is Blackness doesn't necessarily mean what we mean in America, where somebody, I don't know in an academic, but in a casual sense, somebody can be quite fair actually and still be Black because they sort of have, one drop of Black blood. And I was wondering like how Iranians at that time period would have conceptualized like, what Blackness is. Yeah, that's it.
One more, or do I go?
One. You want one more?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, there's a hand in the back. Yes.
Hey, first off, thank you so much for putting on this event and contributing your time. I've been looking forward to this, but this question isn't pertaining to slavery 100%, but it does pertain to that last subject that you were speaking about, which was the civil rights movement in the U.S. and how much of an impact it had on folks in Iran. And my question is, so I've talked to my dad about this, who lived in Iran throughout the 70s. My mother from Iran. And I was really surprised by their answers. I wanted to ask you, how much of when it came to resistance groups in Iran preceding 1978, 79, groups like the Fedai Girls, just the more militant guerrilla groups of the early 70s, how much of an influence would you say the U.S. Resistance movements in general had, because I know, Trinidad and many other national fronts were outlaws throughout the 60s. Anyway, that's basically my question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the question of status is really interesting, and the way I start to explore it in my book is, well, first, anything the royal family does is associated with status, but then you have the advent of photography, right? The camera is invented in 1837. It comes to Iran very quickly. The first Nasiruddin Shah has his first camera in like 1841, right? And he's still Nasiruddin Mirza at that time. But the Qajar court, once Nasiruddin is king, once he's crowned king, Nasiruddin Shah has he starts to take photographs of the enslaved people of his court. And then families start to mimic this throughout the 20th century. So it becomes this visual performance of it's a family portrait, right? But it's really a household portrait because there are people in the photograph that are not members of the family, right? And that they are enslaved. And these photographs were circulated. And so you have examples of photographs that, you know, people would take a photograph of their children seated and an enslaved Black man standing behind them. And in one of the photographs I found, and this sort of goes to your point, because the photographs are color photographs, right? One of the children looks significantly darker than the other two, right? He probably looks like he's the same shade as the man standing behind him. And on the back of the photograph, it says, come visit us. We're sending this photo to you so that you're enticed to visit us. Also, Saifuddin is not as Black as he looks in this photograph. It's just a shadow. So you have this idea that it's visually resonant, right? And that you're supposed to be able to tell in these Black and white or sepia colored photographs who's Black and who's not. So that's the question. That's my answer to that question. That it becomes entangled with photography because photography becomes such a status symbol as well. And then if you saw, because these people are in domestic roles, they're doing a lot of the bidding for the family. And so they're either accompanying the family or they're running errands for them individually. And so it's not just people who are in that domestic sphere, in that same household with them, who are seeing them, but it's also everyone is seeing them in the streets, right? And so if you went to Bazaar and you saw a well-dressed Black man, you would assume that that was an enslaved person because the sort of entertainers and the dervishes were not as well dressed, right? And that was part of the upkeep of the status of slavery. The civil rights movement and the influence of US militant groups and how much they're interacting. I mean, Angela Davis wrote a letter to the Shah saying, like, you know, you have to pay attention to the human rights abuses, and she's paying attention to what's going on in the 1970s. How much they're reacting to that, that's, I think that's something Arang and Gulnar Nikpur have touched on, at least in their work. And Eskandar Sadeghi Burujerdhi, right? So I would recommend you look at their works because they're the ones who they talk a bit about that.
Who was it? Sorry.
Eskandar Sadeghi, Burujerdhi, Arang and Gulnar Nikpur. They're not talking about the Fedayeen, I don't think, but they do talk about how intellectuals in Iran are like Ali Shariati are reading the Fanon or are talking about these different movements and yeah. I haven't seen an example of people saying like, well, the Black Panther movement is doing this in the US, we're going to emulate that. But what was happening with the Black Panthers was reported regularly in the newspapers.
The newspapers.
Yeah.
I imagine it was mainly in big cities, Tehran and Enslavement.
Yeah.
Because when I talked with my dad about this stuff, he was in Abadeh, which is a very small village between Isfahan and Shiraz. And yeah, you know, I brought up this question to him since he was there between 68 and 73, and then again during the revolution. And yeah, he said that there's the only thing he had to say about political stuff was just the brutal repression of
Right.
Salah and
Yeah.
his students disappearing, things of that nature.
Yeah, I don't, that's it.
But
Interesting question.
Okay, I think we do have a time for a couple more questions, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, we have Dylan.
Questions in the chat.
Okay, so Dylan's gonna take 2 questions from the chat, and
Young lady there.
there's a, we'll take those, and maybe a third one from the floor.
Okay. All right. So the first one we have is, can you comment on the way Iranian anti-Arab racism overlaps, conflates, or gets mixed up with Iranian anti-Black racism with the common tactic of assigning responsibility for the Gulf slave trade solely onto Arab others?
You wanna read this? Is there a second one, Dylan?
The second one is the terms Lale and Dade were terms often used in Shiraz for slaves. Have you come across these terms in your research?
I'm sorry, it was Axel was the question? You also had a question?
Yes.
So why don't we take these two questions on the floor and as well. But Axel, if you want to go first.
My name is Axel. I'm going to school here. I'm wondering about the situation of previously enslaved persons after the abolition. It's hard to imagine that the long-running racialized thinking would suddenly go away after the inflection point.
My name is Nina. I don't go to school here. But do you work here? No, I'm not associated with it here. I'm just interested. I wanted to know if you could speak more about that time pre-abolition, where the export import was banned, but there were still enslaved people in Iran, and if and you spoke to how that was like a tool of empire to kind of advance certain goals, but if there were any kind of homegrown movements that were like examining that like internal conflict as well, if you come across that. What internal conflict? Like it's on law that we can't be importing enslaved people, but there are still enslaved people here, and if there's anyone like doing the thinking about like there's a clear moral conflict between that. Okay, so the anti-Arab racism is a really interesting question. There's this every time I feel like Boshu, the film Guided Protectable Stranger, comes up, there's this debate: is he Arab or is he Black? And this is a really frustrating and fascinating like debate to see unfold. But there are people who are vehement that he's not Black, and that he's just Arab, and that he's just from the South, and that he's just tanned because the Southern sun tans more. And this sort of ties into your question: what happened to them? These enslaved people after manumission. So what happened to the free peoples is there's a lot of silence, right? There's silence on behalf of the enslaving families because there's this understanding that it was taboo that Iranians had ever enslaved, and so they come up with these explanations that they were servants, they were servants, they were servants. But also there's such a stigma attached to enslavement that those who like free peoples and their descendants really did not talk about it. And the collective has done some work on this, and they posted some talks where members of the collective have talked about how like their grandparents never told them where they were from because they didn't know, right? And so this becomes really complicated because they are not really complicated, but there's just a lot of silence, right? And there's a lot of vague terminology that's used, but also maybe some of them would have heard more behind closed doors, but never outwardly, publicly. A lot of them took on menial jobs. Some of them were, like I said earlier, married into the families that had once enslaved them. Some of them were like the families would be involved in moving them to a local village. And like I know of one family that still has connections with the people, the descendants of the people that their ancestors had once enslaved. So that even though they live like hours apart, they still know of them, and they will bring them in as servants for certain events. But largely it was very quiet, right? In the South, it was a little bit different because you also had a significant free population, right? And Behnaz Mirza, she has this documentary where she very clearly shows how the people who had free ancestry, like before 1929, who came over as laborers or merchants, will not interact with the people who had enslaved ancestry. So there's a stigma that was pervasive for them. I hope that answers your question. The anti-Arab racism is part and parcel of that same sort of Aryan myth that arises, right? And it becomes part of Iranians distinguishing themselves along these nationalist sort of lines that, oh, we're not Arab, we're not like that. And so the slave trade argument, I found instances of it in the early 20th century, right? I think, if I'm not mistaken, even the day that the law was being, like the debate that was happening in Parliament, I'm pretty sure there's someone who says, you know, but we don't need to abolish this because Iranians know, like there are no Iranians involved in this. This is just something that the Arabs are doing in the South. And again, conflating a lot of different things there. I hope that answers the question. So anti-Arab racism. Lale, Dade, and Shiraz. Yeah, there are a lot of terms in Shiraz that are sort of like brought into the language of enslavement, and that has so much to do with the fact that Shiraz was a major urban city that was very close to the ports, and it was where a lot of the Bajar family had, you know, very like elite homes and had extended that domestic enslavement there too. And there are other words like like that Nahid mentioned. The reason why Behnaz Mirza is able to say something like this is not racist is because in the Shirazi dialect, it means brother, right? Or in the Kabuli dialect, it means uncle. And so it becomes used in a different way outside of Shiraz and even within Shiraz to refer to Black men who are enslaved. But there are these, there's a lot of overlap and exchange. I mean, Dade is used.
That is used in Tehran as Lale.
Very commonly.
Yeah, Dade means black woman.
Yeah, a wet nurse maybe.
Lale is wet nurse.
Mm-hmm.
So, but this was used in Tehran as well as everywhere else.
Absolutely.
Is there any homegrown emancipation movement to like free the slaves? Kind of, or was it all external or out of embarrassment?
Kind of, like it's hard to say. So like Behnaz Mirza has worked on, she's mentioned certain Sufi groups who would have been interested in abolition. And so that's why you see free Black men who are dervishes, because they were, you know, incorporated into these different Sufi orders. And then also, of course, Baha'u'llah abolishes enslavement for Baha'i faith, for followers of the Baha'i faith in the 1880s, after he writes to Queen Victoria, like thanking her for her work. And so there are instances of it, and they're all very much rooted in religion. You also, by the constitutional period, by the 20th century, you have people like the Khoda and others writing about how we should be more like the British, and we should not have enslavement because look how much more advanced they are than us. And there's this argument that's happening about freedom. And so, for example, Taj al-Santana, who was a Qajar princess, she writes about how she would have had such a better marriage if there were no servants or enslaved people in her home, because then she would have been able to actually know her husband. But actually, because there are all these different statuses of labor, right? Like free and unfree. In her home, she's sort of kept separate from him, and they can't have a fulfilling marriage. Those are the sorts of arguments that come up. But that's like into the 20th century. So you already have these sort of like a lot of instances of enslavement have already died out, right? And it's already seen as embarrassing for a lot of people.
Can I just add something? Yes. That in the constitutional period, 1905, 1911, a lot of the newspapers discussed this whole notion of citizenship, equal citizenship for everyone. And there is some mention of it, not a whole lot, but there is, as part of a larger movement for citizenship and equal rights for everybody, including minorities, etc. That comes up from time to time.
And if that was your original motivation for your project, to understand enslavement, citizenship as maybe the ultimate way of erasing these differences, right? So it's actually interesting.
But even earlier, say in like Racialized Kalame, Mozaffari basically speaks about all Iranians as a slave, because the debate is about citizenship. So that may be a different context than the US, because these intellectuals or members of the elites who were involved in these debates were mostly engaged in the rights of citizenship for everyone. And as far as I can remember, the slaves reference are on everyone, ordinary individuals in Iran, and not on what this discussion is about.
I think I speak on behalf of Dylan. You're raising your hand in the back.
One more question in the chat. I don't know if you're continuing.
No, I think we're at a point we've abused our taking advantage of our panelists at this point. So maybe you can pick. We can give you the question later. But I think I'm going to speak on behalf of everyone that we're very excited to read your book in the coming months and years, and also the edited volume that Nahid is also publishing. So we're approaching a new turn in the study of enslavement in Iran. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.